She must be secure in the knowledge that simply in her willingness to confront the perpetrator, she has overcome one of the most terrible consequences of the trauma. She has let him know he cannot rule her by fear, and she has exposed his crime to others. Her recovery is based not on the illusion that evil has been overcome, but rather on the knowledge that it has not entirely prevailed, and on the hope that restorative love may still be found in the world.
When you're with me on the way, in my heart and mind you'll stay. I can make it through the night.
And you're saying, in a sense, that the person, the institution who stole so much from you, they're no longer the author of your story, and you don't need their permission anymore to write the next chapter of your life.
I would challenge leaders to be a part of the justice process, to be a supporter, to be a proponent, to be an advocate of the justice process, rather than against it. When it feels I'm all alone, it's your hand if I don't. And really, there's a lot of research that talks about the impact that faith institutions can have on a person who's been abused. It can either be harmful or it can be helpful, and it actually can be the most helpful part of someone's healing.
Thanks for attending today's Grace Live conversation, where we're looking at action in the absence of justice. What can we do when it seems like no matter what we've done, what we've tried, there seems to be an absence of justice? What then is left to us? My name is Pete Singer. I'm the Executive Director of Grace, and I want to encourage you as we have this conversation to remember that some of the things that we talk about today may be unsettling or may be heavy to bear. And so if you're finding that that is the case, please do take care of yourselves, whatever that may involve. That could involve praying, that could involve deep breathing or positive imagery, or it may also mean just stepping away from the program for a bit. This program today is going to be recorded and it is going to be on our YouTube channel. And so it is perfectly fine to just step away, and then you can watch whatever you may have missed once it's placed on our YouTube channel within a week or so. So please take care of yourselves during this conversation. I'm the Executive Director over at Grace, which stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. And Grace really works to help faith communities better recognize, prevent, and respond to all forms of abuse across the lifespan. That might be child abuse, that might be adult clergy sexual abuse, that might be spiritual abuse, that might be intimate partner violence or sexual harassment, but we're looking at all forms of abuse and misconduct across the lifespan. Please know that at the end of our discussion today, there will be a question and answer time. We're going to try and get to all the questions and answers that may come in. But if your question doesn't get answered, please know that you can also email us at info@netgrace.org. That's info@netgrace.org with thoughts, with questions that may not have been answered during our program today. We have some absolutely incredible guests here with us today. We have Wade Mullen and Amy Steer joining us. And I'm going to just ask Wade and Amy to introduce themselves and to give us a little bit of background about who our experts on the panel are today.
Hi, Pete. Thanks for the opportunity to share. It's an honor to be on this call. My name is Wade Mullen. I've been with Grace as an institutional response specialist for about 5 years now, helping with independent assessments and investigations I wrote a book a few years ago called Something's Not Right, Decoding the Hidden Tactics of Abuse and Freeing Yourself from Its Power. And in that book, I describe some of my own personal story and also share what I learned through years of research looking at how evangelical organizations and churches have responded to crises and events that threaten their image. And so that work, the book, and the efforts throughout the past 5 or 10 years has given me opportunity to assist individuals and organizations who are trying to understand abuse dynamics well, and also trying to understand how to respond with care and compassion. So that's a little bit about me.
Thanks so much, Pete, for having us today. I'm Amy, and I, like Wade, was an institutional response specialist at Grace for, I'd say, almost 10 years, and have recently branched out on my own. And I'm a licensed attorney in the state of Texas. So my husband and I have a law firm here in Texas, and currently still engaged in a lot of the same work, occasionally working on investigations, but also sometimes helping clients with this in this field from the legal perspective. So I've also done investigations into allegations of sexual misconduct, stalking, violence, sexual harassment in the university setting. So that's as a Title IX investigator. All of my experience is in faith institutions and in faith settings. So alongside investigating allegations of sexual misconduct, have also kind of gained a lot of knowledge base about other forms of abuse, such as domestic violence, emotional misconduct, as well as a lot of knowledge of spiritual abuse. So thank you so much for having us, Pete.
Absolutely. And thank you for joining us and being on the program today. It's great to have you here. Well, when we talk about action in the absence of justice, it's helpful to know what we even mean by justice. If we look at a purely legal definition, it would be a process of using laws to fairly judge and punish crimes. But often when we're dealing with abuse or misconduct that has occurred in a faith setting, we're looking at something a little bit different than that. We're looking at something that may have a different definition. And it's going to look different for each person. For some situations, it may look like support for the victims. For other situations, it may look like accountability for the perpetrator. Sometimes it's going to be transparency or improved prevention that the church is doing to make sure that this doesn't happen again. But it may have different, it may appear differently in various situations. One of the things that's going to impact that is what type of abuse or misconduct was involved prior to even attempting some form of justice. Amy, can you help us understand what are some of those forms of abuse or misconduct for which we're often seeking justice?
Sure. So when I think of different forms of abuse, obviously there's a lot of different types of abuse, but it could be what I've dealt a lot with in my kind of experience is child sexual abuse. There could be adult sexual assault, which is an assault when an individual is an adult. There could be sexual harassment. There could be stalking, violence. There could be interpersonal violence that maybe shows up in some way in a church setting. And there could also be emotional abuse. There could be physical abuse. Maybe someone engages in physical violence in the church. Emotional misconduct or emotional abuse, which oftentimes can be just as detrimental as forms of sexual misconduct. And then there's also spiritual abuse, which I have seen a lot in my work, especially working with sexual misconduct in faith institutions. And then what I will say is that oftentimes there's often like a lot of different layers of different kinds of abuse within one specific type of situation. So those are just some broad generalizations of the different forms of abuse that can show up in the church setting. And then I also want to be very sure that I include clergy abuse, right? Clergy sexual abuse. So that is abuse that happens, sexual misconduct that happens at the hands of a pastor or a clergy member.
All right, thank you. So that really does help us understand that we're not just talking about one type of abuse or misconduct, but there are many, many ways that abuse or misconduct can show up, especially within a faith setting when you throw in that spiritual element to things that's often not there in more of a business setting. Speaking of settings, there are also lots of different contexts in which abuse or misconduct may happen. Wade, can you help us understand a little bit about the different contexts in which these situations may occur?
Yeah, because I think when you are exploring various options, the setting or the context becomes important because that's going to influence the various avenues that you might have. So, for instance, did the abuse take place in a church? And if it took place in a church, is that a independent, autonomous church, or is it a church that's part of a larger denomination? Did the abuse take place in a school or a college? Did it take place in a therapy setting or in counseling? And I think you could even think in terms of the jurisdiction. So did the abuse take place in a certain state? So, for example, adult clergy sexual abuse is a crime in, I believe, 14 jurisdictions now. Well, the options that you might have for pursuing justice in that case is going to look different depending on the jurisdiction that you're in. So I think it's important to think about the context or the setting. And a principle that I believe applies to that is this, that often when you're taking steps toward justice, you're asking the question, who is the next highest authority that I might be able to report to or appeal to? And that's going to look different depending on that context. And so, for instance, someone who's experienced spiritual abuse at the hands of a pastor in a local church, the next highest authority might only be the board, if there is even one. Whereas if someone's experienced similar abuse in the context of a larger network of churches, then maybe if that denomination or that network is structured in such a way that there is a higher entity that people can report to, then there are going to be kind of additional layers of authority that a person can appeal to. And so I definitely think the context matters as well.
Wow, so that is helpful information to know just how much of a difference the context matters, whether it's at a church or a school or a church, whether there is leadership above the person who allegedly offended. There are just so many things that even what state you're in can determine whether or not you have options for responding to, for example, clergy sexual abuse. So lots of things to keep in mind there. And with all this information of, while abuse has a very personal meaning, there are lots of different types of abuse and misconduct. There are lots of different contexts in what that would impact what actions we can take. This is all a lot of information. Amy, where do we even start?
Yeah, that's a really great question. One thing that I like to do when I'm working with survivors or people who have experienced abuse is asking them. So in my mind, justice is a restorative process. It's a process of repairing the harm that has occurred. Obviously, we will never be able to undo or change the past. And for most people that I meet, almost everybody, abuse will always be a part of their journey and their always be impacting their life in some way. But justice is one way that we can try to repair the harm that has occurred. And so I just say, what does justice look like to you when I'm working with survivors and victims? Because for some people, it might be very different. Some people, they really just want an apology, right, for the harms that occurred. Some people want legal action. Some people want all types of different avenues, and we'll talk more about what the options are later. But I think that it's important that those who have been harmed really kind of sit with that question themselves to say, like, what does justice look like to me? And what would aid me in my healing journey to really repair some of the harm that has occurred? Like I said, we can never completely repair everything, but what are some steps that we can take to try to restore and repair? And accountability is a huge part of that. And so, yeah, what does it look like for you? And that's going to be personalized to each person. I will say it's really important to mention that if it is involving present day child sexual abuse, you may not be able to answer that question yourself. It may be very much out of your hands, whereas the state is going to decide what justice will occur. They're going to investigate it, hopefully, and they're going to bring justice and bring charges against the victim if it's involving present day child sexual abuse. And even in some states, if it's involving historical child sexual abuse and the individual still has access to minors, that may be very much out of your hands. But in other scenarios, we can say, what does justice look like to me? So yeah, that's kind of the first step that I always kind of help survivors talk through and kind of work through is that piece. And then from there, we can really kind of start to navigate really what we're going to be doing, what questions we're going to be asking of the church and other parties that may have been involved.
Wow. So important just to know, what even do we consider justice, and to recognize that that is at an individual, often an individual level. You also raised a very important point in that as we're seeking justice, we can't forget that there are some methods already set up, especially when it comes to the abuse of children. And so really the importance of making that report, whether you are a mandated reporter, which in some states involves all adults, and in other states involves more people of a certain profession. But regardless of whether you're a mandated reporter by law, there are ethical and moral considerations that go into making that report. And none of the states prohibit you from making a report. So it is always a good thing in the case of child abuse, child maltreatment, to make that report to the authorities to see if they'll pursue any type of justice. And then also as that possible source of justice is explored, looking at other things that may also help the situation, whether that would be consultation, whether that would be the possibility of an independent investigation, or whatever else that might involve. So one of the things that we then move on to, okay, so we've established there are a lot of things and a lot of variables that impact what justice is. And this idea of justice is often a very personal idea, but at times also has a more universal meaning. So we've got this idea of justice, but for whatever reason, it seems not to have occurred in this situation. Maybe child protection didn't investigate. Maybe the police didn't investigate. Maybe the church seems to be turning a blind eye, or even trying to defend the organization rather than protecting the person who may have been harmed. So now we've entered into a situation where we've got all this information, but justice seems not to have occurred. Wade, what do we do?
Well, I think, Amy makes a good point about the pursuit of justice needing to be individualized, especially at that stage, because so often there is an erosion of identity and a loss of agency in an abusive experience. You lose your sense of voice, of personal values, confidence in your own self or your own understanding of what's true. And so in some ways, I think the next best step is the one that you choose. It's the one you decide to take, because that agency is so often what's been robbed from somebody. And so you begin to take those steps, and you're saying in a sense that the person, the institution who stole so much from you, they're no longer the author of your story, and you don't need their permission anymore to write the next chapter of your life. And so I think that's important. And then there are some principles I believe are helpful to just about any scenario. And one is that as you begin to take those steps to find your support system, to find your circle, your group, and hopefully it's of support from those who recognize that your own agency and your own choice, your own empowerment matters. So they're not making choices for you, but they're there to support you. And they might be two people who can provide insight and an understanding of the various systems that might still be available to you. They might help you think through strategy and through options. So I think that support system is really important. The second principle that I believe is helpful is to understand that justice for many people never happens. It never comes in the ways that we might expect it to. And so I think managing those expectations is important. And as it relates to this, I thought of a quote from Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery. And she's come out with a recent one this past year called Truth and Repair. But this one she wrote in the 90s. And I just wanted to read a couple of lines from this book, because I think it really speaks to the experience of someone who's at this point of, let's say, they've exhausted every process that might be available to them. And for so many people, that's their experience. They say, I went through all of those layers and I appealed to the next highest authority, and I got to a point where there was no one left to report to or appeal to. And sometimes that's when somebody, goes public, or they write a blog, or for very good reasons, they begin to take more public action. And so Judith Herman, I think, has some good encouragement for those who choose to do that. So she writes on page 211, the survivor who undertakes public action also needs to come to terms with the fact that not every battle will be won. Her particular battle becomes part of a larger ongoing struggle to impose the rule of law on the arbitrary tyranny of the strong. This sense of participation is sometimes all that she has to sustain her. The sense of alliance with others who support her and believe in her cause can console her even in defeat. And then a few sentences later, she writes, the survivor who elects to engage in public battle cannot afford to delude herself about the inevitability of victory. She must be secure in the knowledge that simply in her willingness to confront the perpetrator, she has overcome one of the most terrible consequences of the trauma. She has let him know he cannot rule her by fear, and she has exposed his crime to others. Her recovery is based not on the illusion that evil has been overcome, but rather on the knowledge that it has not entirely prevailed, and on the hope that restorative love may still be found in the world. And I think those are some really profound lines. And the last thing I'll say in response to that question, that I guess is a practical application of that, is somebody might reach a point where they have exhausted all of the known paths that they can take at the moment. And I've spoken with some who decide, I'm going to write my experience down in the form of a letter, and I'm going to send it to, say, the church. At this point, I don't expect anything good will come of it, that they'll take action on it, but I'm going to write, and so that they know that this is what I experienced, so that they can't say that they never knew. And then, 10, 15 years later, those patterns of abuse have continued. Often they worsen, and other people with similar experiences come forward. And then finally there's maybe some exposure, maybe there's new leaders in place, and there's action taken that should have been taken 10, 15 years ago. And then as part of that process, that letter or that record, that information that was provided years earlier becomes part of a process of justice that person could have never foreseen. And so I say that not to give anybody any kind of false hope, that because I think that's rare, but I think it speaks to this sense that Judith Herman is referencing, that your efforts might be part of a larger effort to resist and combat abuse in the world.
I'll just add to what Wade said. I mean, I think that the process itself, just like you said, Wade, the process itself is sometimes all the justice that there is, right? And in someone's experience and in their journey. And those are some of the most difficult cases really to work on, to really find that, especially in cases that maybe weren't handled properly at the time of the allegations. Like maybe it's a historical case and it wasn't handled properly then, and maybe the statute of limitations has now run, and there's not enough evidence to try it in a court of law, in a criminal court of law. And there's all of these avenues that have been kind of just feels like there's just nothing left. Sometimes people have, accept the experience, and just going through that process can be a very healing journey. It can also be a very disheartening journey too. So that's why it's really important that you have that really strong support group to help you through that process. I wanted to briefly just talk about different types of justice that people pursue. I may be getting ahead of myself, but I just wanted to talk, like, one thing I think that what we're talking a lot about here are like things that you can do, but I also want to just reiterate at the beginning before I say some other things here is like doing nothing can also be a form of justice, right? Like, we talk about, writing a letter or filing with law enforcement or getting a legal team involved. Like sometimes just speaking with your feet and getting up and maybe leaving a church that, isn't healthy for you, or other things like that. Like that is very courageous too. And so I don't want anybody to hear us today say, if you're not doing these things, you're not seeking justice, because like, that's what we were talking about early on, that justice really is individualized to each person and what that looks like in their own life and for their own mental health. If you're in a mental health crisis, you may not have the ability or the resources to be able to go to church leadership, or go report to law enforcement, or hire a legal team. And so being very aware that some of these options may not be available to everyone. And so, but some things that people can do is, like we've mentioned, Wade mentioned writing a letter, kind of speaking up to the church. There are certain situations where I wouldn't recommend that. If it's involving abuse of a clergy member, like I would never recommend someone go to their abuser and speak out. But, maybe putting people on notice about what's happened to you, especially if that person still has access to people, is still actively engaging in harm. There is reporting to the police. All the states are different. I saw a question in the question box. I did just want to say that child sexual abuse is a crime in every state. It's also a federal crime. So, just to be clear, that is a crime in every state. So if anyone has told you otherwise, that's false information. Also, you can get a legal team involved. And it doesn't always involve you having to pay money up front. Some attorneys will take cases on a contingency fee, which means they only get paid if they win on the backside of it. So that's actually not a lot of people know about that. So I think that's really great, because it provides maybe an opportunity for someone to have justice that maybe otherwise wouldn't. And then I always tell people, like, even if you don't know if you have a legal claim or you want to pursue civil action, which is basically like suing the church or suing your perpetrator or suing the entity that harmed you, just set up a consult call with an attorney to just ask questions. That's a part of justice too. It's just being curious, asking questions, set up an appointment with someone down at the DA's office and ask questions about, the facts of your case to see if it would be prosecuted if you wanted to report. Like, just being curious and asking questions and seeking information is a part of that journey, and it doesn't commit you to one thing. And so that's what I would say. I did just briefly want to say, I know we talked about when we were prepping for this, there's been sometimes in our circles, like a lot of conversations about seeking legal counsel, because it's, scriptures talk about how we're not to sue our brothers and sisters, right? We're not to take them to court. But there's a lot of scriptures in the Bible that talk about that we're to pursue justice and that we're to pursue accountability. And sometimes that process is a part of the process that God might use to bring justice and to bring accountability. And so I really would, I feel like sometimes that conversation is very one-sided, and it doesn't really look at a lot of other things within scriptures that might go against what that is saying. And so we really need to look at any scriptures that we're talking about to guide survivors to not pursue certain avenues of justice, that when we're giving that kind of spiritual counsel, that it's done in a way that is within the context and is not done in a way that will further cause harm or done in a way that is spiritually abusive. So.
Great. Well, that gives us a lot to think about and a lot to contemplate. Before we head to a question and answer section for today, one question I would have for each of you, and if you could each weigh in on this: do you have a message or a challenge for faith leaders? And that might be how those faith leaders can help obtain or help have justice for those involved, or it might be what those faith leaders can do when there seems to be no justice involved. Sometimes there are multiple faith leaders at a church, and one faith leader is engaged in abuse or misconduct, and other faith leaders are trying to hold them accountable, but they need to know what they can do. So sometimes it might be, how can faith leaders help secure justice? And sometimes it might be, what can faith leaders do in the absence of justice?
I think one way is by being transparent about the avenues that might be available to someone who has experienced abuse or misconduct. So let's say, for instance, someone has experienced mistreatment in the context of a church, some form of emotional or spiritual abuse. And if that church has existing policies on how report might be received, how it might be responded to, if it has policies that governs the behavior of staff and elders, codes of conduct that could be implicated, then is the church leadership being transparent about that? So there's a principle that I think is instructive here of proactive disclosure. That is the organization making all of their policies and procedures. Well, first of all, do they have them? And if they have them, are they providing those to people? Do people know how to access them? Can they ask questions about them? Do they understand them? Because in too many situations that I've seen, somebody begins to pursue justice within the context of a church, let's say, and they don't find out about the policies or the procedures that might impact that pursuit until they run up against it. And so I think transparency is important. And then the other one that I think is significant is that, often people who are in leadership end up in the role of a bystander. And I think it's important for leaders to think through the question, who am I going to be when and if I learn of abuse that's been perpetuated by, let's say, a fellow colleague or somebody who's in a position of power over me? What is my response going to be? And I think that's important for leaders to think through, so that when that time comes, they might act with moral courage. They might stand against injustice, even if it means that, and I recognize that this is often sadly the case, even if it means that they then receive maybe some form of retaliation, or they might experience some kind of loss because of the stand that they take. But to think through that, I think is important.
I think that's so really good, Wade. And I love that question, like, who am I going to be? Because it's really not a question of if you face this. It's really a question of when, as a leader, and who am I going to be when that moment for me comes? And I would challenge leaders to be a part of the justice process, to be a supporter, to be a proponent, to be an advocate of the justice process, rather than against it. And really, there's a lot of research that talks about the impact that faith institutions can have on a person who's been abused. It can either be harmful or it can be helpful. And it actually can be the most helpful part of someone's healing if it's done well and if it's done right. And so asking yourself, who am I going to be, and choosing that we're going to be on the side of justice, that we're going to be proponents and advocates of justice and healing for survivors beforehand, and then taking steps before that moment comes to you to really learn and understand what that really looks like and what it means to do it well, so that we can be advocates of healing and support and health, have healthy responses rather than unhealthy responses. Because I cannot tell you how many survivors have told me, I have spent more time in therapy for how the church responded to my disclosure of abuse than I have the actual abuse itself. And I think that that's very telling, because we as the body of Christ really have the power. When you talk about power, we have the power to be agents of healing. And we can, if we do the hard work up front, can really do that. So that's what I would say, is do the hard work now. Ask yourself those hard questions now, so that when that moment comes, you handle it well, and we're agents of healing.
Wow, that's really good, both Amy and Wade. That's very good advice. Really for faith leaders that are looking to do the right thing, that are looking to either pursue justice or to help a person who is acting in what appears to be the absence of justice. One thing I wanted to mention before we head to our question and answer section is that often when we're trying to do these things in the absence of justice, whether we're a faith leader, whether we're a person who has experienced that abuse, that misconduct directly, or whether we're a person who's been impacted because we see the results of it, this is heavy work. This is work that should not be done alone. So if at all possible, as you are looking for how do you move forward in this situation, please make sure that if possible, you start seeing either a therapist or a pastoral counselor that you trust. It would have to be one that you trust. And that counselor, that therapist would have to be one who's skilled in dealing with trauma, preferably one who's skilled in dealing with religious trauma, although those are sometimes difficult to find. So please make sure that you're not doing this work alone. The harm came to you through relationship. And as you work through your response to the harm, that is best done in relationship as well. If there are people that you can trust to be in relationship with. So please do look at that. We've had several questions come in during the course of the conversation today, and I'll just run through them. If we do not get to a question that you have posed, please, please, please send it to our email at info@netgrace.org. Again, that's info@netgrace.org. So the first question that came in is, a couple of them have already been answered, so I'm not trying to neglect those that came in earlier, but a couple of them have been answered in the chat already. What is the difference between abuse that is occurring at a church, so that the abuse is actually occurring on property, as opposed to abuse that is away from a formal church setting? How can we make sure that we address both of those situations and don't just accept as an excuse, well, I wasn't at church when it happened?
This feels like a very much of a legal question. I saw this question come through. I'm trying to get back to it because I want to make sure that I'm reading it. But first of all, I'll just say that any answers that I give you today, it's not legal advice. I'm licensed in the state of Texas, and anybody who has legal questions should seek legal counsel in your state. But when we're talking about situations that happen on site versus situations that happen off site as terms of liability, I think that was the question, Pete. Am I right about that?
Sure. Yeah, for terms of liability, and also, and if possible, pull in some things on prevention as well. So how could we even prevent? What are some things that we can do on prevention with a situation like that?
Okay, yeah. So in terms of liability, it really, what we're talking about there is whether a person is acting within their scope of employment. So that is determining liability, and that really is a question that you should ask your legal counsel. There's like a lot of factors in play that might be at play there. And just because it happened off-site, like say it's a school teacher on a field trip, that field trip is within the scope of employment, so it's possible that liability is still at play. So those are questions that you should ask a legal counsel in your jurisdiction. And a good attorney would find no way for that to be within the scope of employment. But in terms of like prevention, policies and procedures are really going to be crucial to determining sort of how this would play out. So whenever there is sort of a situation of liability, the first thing I, as an attorney, am going to do is I'm going to look at their at their policies and procedures and say, like, what did their policies say? What are their policies really saying that they should do as someone? And so policies really need to try to involve all situations that would come into play, both on-site and off-site. And there's ways that that can happen. You know, I would call that like an outside contact sort of thing, of like, your policy should include what your employees are going to do in terms of like outside contact with students or youth group kids. Like, are they going to be allowed to babysit? Are they going to be, I would recommend that's a no, but like those kinds of things. And really, Grace is great at policies and procedures. So having an expert like Grace or an attorney who understands these things, because a lot of attorneys that look at these policies are just purely coming at it from an employment law standpoint. They need to really understand sexual abuse in the law too. But having an expert really look at the policies is important. And that is also a part of justice is, hey, this happened and this happened to me and I don't want it to happen to somebody else. So let's get your policies in order, and asking leadership to do that. As well as maybe an independent investigation, right? If it wasn't handled properly, can also be a really great avenue. If other avenues of justice, like the civil court or the criminal court, isn't possible, like an independent investigation is a really great way that churches can sort of engage in that justice process. And Grace is great at both.
Thanks, Amy.
Mm-hmm.
So are you.
No.
Any further thoughts, Wade?
No, I mean, I think that answer is great. So I don't have anything to add.
All right. One of the things that was mentioned earlier, the person was, I think, interested both in like what category people might fall, but also some of the dynamics. Often people are receiving harm not directly from the abuse of a leader within a faith community, but from seeing that abuse impacting others and realizing, oh my goodness, this is throughout my faith community. I know that, for example, I grew up in elementary school in a highly abusive faith community, and they tied a lot of their toxic doctrine and their toxic teachings directly to life-giving teachings. And so even when it comes time to think through and try and process through and untangle those, it can become a really difficult process to untangle the toxic teachings from the life-giving teachings, because they were so enmeshed and so bound together. But what are some ways that it affects people? And I think the answer was already given for what terms might be for a group that they would fall into. What are some ways that can impact a person where they're not the person that's directly harmed, but they see the harm and they're part of a faith community where there was harm, and so they're trying to just work through that harm? What are some of the dynamics there?
I think one of the significant dynamics, anytime you're talking about harm and abuse that's been experienced in the context of a faith community, is the dynamic of trust. And so when a person or a group of people who are in a position of trust misuse their power to, usually it's about getting something that they don't have, that they want, and they inflict harm on and abuse on others, that is a betrayal of the trust that those individuals, that person has in the life of a community. And I think anytime somebody becomes aware of that, there is this sense of betrayal. And the work of Dr. Jennifer Fried comes to mind, Freyd, and she has done a lot of work on institutional betrayal, and has a tagline to her book that states, why we fool ourselves, we aren't being fooled. And she and her colleagues have done a lot of work in trying to help us understand the dynamics of betrayal within the context of an institution. And so I think that's one of the factors that needs to be thought through, even if somebody hasn't directly experienced abuse. When they become aware of it, when they witness it, there is, I believe, this possibility that their own trust in that institution and in its leaders is damaged.
Yeah. Amy, did you have anything to add?
I was just gonna say, I think that I think someone said that it was like a secondary victim is what that's called, and I was gonna say that secondary trauma, right? Or it could also be for not secondary trauma. It could be level 1 trauma, and it can be very impactful too. And I think that sometimes people who are in those situations minimize it in their life to say, oh, well, I don't know why I'm feeling this way. I wasn't the victim. Or sometimes those sort of people that have that kind of highly discerning empathy for the victims can be kind of discredited as well, you're just over exaggerating, or it really is not that bad, or you weren't impacted. Why are you taking this so hard? But the Bible tells us to bear one another's burdens. And so that's actually very biblical, and very what's happening to you is you're bearing someone else's burdens. You're feeling the pain that they're feeling. And that can be just as impactful as being a victim. And so I just would not minimize that in your own life if you're experiencing that, and seek therapy and seek support groups, because coming out of a situation like that can be very disorienting to realize that your pastor who you sat under for however many years or has engaged in really egregious behavior, sometimes criminal behavior. And that the undoing of that is just can be very traumatizing. So don't minimize it in your life. And if you're feeling the effects of that, please seek help.
There's been research done on violence in the workplace, where people are assaulted in one way or another. And what they have found is that people that observe the violence have almost as many impacts as those who are the direct victim of the violence, in many ways, because there are services, there are supports that are directed towards that person who was harmed, but there aren't services and supports directed toward the person who witnessed it. And so I think that that's very true to keep in mind, that, yeah, the impact of witnessing or observing that harm can be very profound. And a lot of times there aren't going to be services and supports readily available for you. So if possible, seek those out. And that might be seeking out a therapist. That might be a variety of things that could be involved with seeking that support. So please, if you have witnessed abuse and harm in a faith setting, please seek out the support that you need. We have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up. And that question is, do either of you know of groups that are organizing around the idea of trying to make clergy sexual abuse a crime in other states where it is not a crime? We mentioned that in some states it is a crime already to engage in clergy sexual abuse, to commit clergy sexual abuse. But in some states, in the majority of states, it's not a crime. Do either of you know of groups that are gathering around this idea of let's make it a crime?
That's a great question. I had on my notes to mention that advocating for policy change is another great way, it's another avenue of justice, especially when a lot of your sort of justice remedies have kind of like been exhausted or the statute of limitations has run, I know a lot of victims have gotten really into and really become really strong advocates for statute of limitation reform and policy reform. And so I love this question. Wade might know. I don't currently know. I have a few ideas of people that might be trying to change this legislation. And so reach out to me if you want to. I could try to connect you with some people. But I love this question. And I'm in the state of Texas, and the state of Texas is one of the states that has that. So it can be really helpful for those who are victims of clergy sexual abuse to have that other added, criminal legal justice avenue.
All right. Wade, are you aware of any groups?
I am aware of individuals that have engaged in that kind of a process. And I am also aware of groups that have organized in recent years to provide education and awareness and support for survivors of adult clergy sexual abuse. I don't know to the extent in which they might be engaged in that particular effort. Restored Voices Collective is one that I'm
I was going to
aware
mention
of.
them, yeah.
Yeah, there's a website that has a host of resources. I believe it's clergysexualmisconduct.com. And so I think on some of the websites and resources that are out there on the topic, you can find information about recent work to try to get laws passed.
I know we have we need to go, but there's like some chatter going on the side I really want to address. Someone had said, isn't sexual abuse a crime in every state? I want to take this minute to say sexual assault, which is abuse. So when you're talking about abuse, you're talking about non-consensual sexual contact. If it's involving a minor, there is no consent. It's statutorily, that's abuse. It's against the law because the minor does not have the ability to consent. When you're looking at sexual abuse or sexual assault, sexual misconduct between two adults, the issue that becomes at play is consent. Was the sexual contact consensual? And so in a legal term, what we're looking at is we're looking at this issue of consent. And almost every case of sexual assault is going to be around this issue of consent. What the clergy sexual abuse law has done is that it has said if it is involving, in the state of Texas, a clergy member who is acting in their position as a spiritual advisor, consent is not at issue. So in a court of law, we're not going to talk about consent. It's because they were a clergy member engaging in behavior. Consent is that piece of it is kind of resolved. And so I want to say that because I want to be clear, anytime that someone is a victim of sexual assault, which is it is a crime, and it does not matter who is engaging in that behavior, it should be reported. And so it's a crime. And so it doesn't matter if your pastor did it or if your pastor, it doesn't matter. If it's a sexual assault, it's a crime in every state. And so you can still report that. There are some additional measures that some states will take into consideration if the abuse happened at the hands of a clergy. So I just want to be very clear, like if you're a victim of sexual assault, as an adult, you should report it, and there are still legal avenues for you in that case. So possibly. So that's a little bit of a lesson. I'm sorry to get a little deep and heavy at the end there, but I wanted to make clear that everyone knows that you can still report it, even if it involves your clergy member. Yeah.
That's very important. And the laws that go into effect calling clergy sexual abuse a crime, saying that we don't have to look at the question of consent because of that power differential, because of the role that the person had. In essence, those are professionalizing pastoral care to the same level that a therapist
Exactly.
is required to do their job. It doesn't matter if there
Exactly.
was apparent consent.
Mhm.
Simply because of the power differential that's there, there is potential for what occurred to have been illegal. And
Mhm.
so it's very similar to that.
Mhm.
Well, thank you everyone for just the great questions that came in. Obviously, we're not going to be able to get to them all, but if your question was not answered today, please do email us at info@netgrace.org, and we can try and get back to you with an answer to those questions. Again, that was info@netgrace.org. Thanks for joining us today. We invite you to check out our website at www.netgrace.org. And we also invite you to come to next month's Grace Live Conversation, to May's Grace Live Conversation. Thank you very much for everyone who came, and we'll see you next time. Bye.